Good morning, Andy. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, great to have the chance to talk. And thank you for making the time to join this series of Sentientist Conversations. And as we've
Um,
talked about briefly, it centers on the two deepest philosophical questions: what's real, how should we understand the world, and what matters morally, what should we care about? And I'm biased because I'm trying to raise awareness of this very simple worldview or philosophy called Sentientism, which says we should take a naturalistic approach to understanding what's real. And when it comes to what matters, we should care about all sentient beings, any being that's capable of suffering and flourishing. But I'm very
you
interested to
state
find
that
out whether you agree or disagree. We'll find out.
so far. I'm loving what I'm hearing. Let's run with it. I think you state that just with beautiful simplicity. We need to understand what is, and we need to care for what matters, and we need to do both of those, and we need a clear understanding of both.
Yeah,
So,
thank you.
yeah,
And your work, I think, is going to be deeply resonant with both of those topics. And they seem like really silly questions in a way to ask of professional philosophers like you. But part of my frustration is that most of philosophy seems to have moved beyond those fundamental questions and working on more abstruse sort of crazy trolley problems. And I think we need to go back to those foundations because most of the human
yeah.
race has got them wrong. So, yeah.
I have enough of a foot outside of professional philosophy now, so that I can validate that. I also find that the hyper specialization and technical nature of academic philosophy is causing it to miss some of the simpler and most important questions, or at least not give them the kind of attention they deserve.
Fortunately, we're going to put it all right today. So, yeah.
Excellent. Let's do it.
Before we get onto those two central questions, for people who don't know of your work already, how would you best introduce yourself?
I am a philosopher by training. I've taught for a long while, first at Hamilton College and then at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. I've been trying to figure out a better way to teach critical thinking for a very long time. And back in the early 90s, I discovered, in collaboration with some students, that if you think of the mind as having an immune system and figure out how we can boost that immune system, and if we actually apply the concepts of immunology to understand how minds filter out bad ideas, if you do all of that, we can take critical thinking to new heights. We can become clearer and wiser versions of ourselves. So I'm now promoting what I call a cognitive immunology. It's the science of mental immune health. And I've discovered that the empirical evidence for mental immune systems goes back 60 years. And although this is largely overlooked by mainstream science, there is, in fact, a new science emerging, which is going to help us develop better tools for combating epidemics of nonsense. And my new book on the subject, Mental Immunity, with a foreword by Steven Pinker, is just out in a few weeks now, and it seems to be generating a lot of interest. And I hope your listeners will check it out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and congratulations on the book launch, and fits beautifully
Thank you.
into the first of our two topics. And I would argue fits into the second topic about morality too, but I'd be interested to get your views. So the first of those two questions is what's real? And for many of my guests, that's a story about whether they grew up originally in quite a naturalistic, skeptic, maybe scientific minded family and context and society, or whether it was more spiritual or supernatural or mystical, and how their philosophy has shifted over time and where they are now when it comes to trying to assess what's real. So it'd be good to know that sort of personal story for you, and obviously, given your book,
Yeah,
how you think about understanding reality now.
sure. So I was raised in a family that didn't have any specific religious affiliation. My mother did sign us up for a local Quaker meeting. And for a few years, I was a member of the local Friends meeting here in Pittsburgh. But I never felt any pressure to embrace the kind of supernaturalistic trappings of some Quakerism. In fact, most of the Quakers I know are pretty chill with a naturalistic view of the world.
Yeah.
My own view is that much supernatural believing is actually unaccountable believing. So nature, reality, I think, is the one thing that can hold us accountable for our beliefs. And if we don't check to make sure that our existence claims are supported by objective empirical evidence, our beliefs tend to drift not just apart from reality, but also tend to drift apart from one another. So we end up having very different views of reality, and then it becomes hard to reconcile our differences.
Mm.
So I think the real solution to our ideologically divided times is to get back to a naturalistic understanding of what's real and hold ourselves accountable to real evidence. And we need to do this because non-reality based believing is spreading in almost in a viral way across the internet, and it's causing huge amounts of social dislocation and harm. And it's up to all of us, I think, to promote accountable talk, even where that might challenge or force us to revise our religious convictions.
Yeah. And I like the way you framed that, because you were almost implying there's two reasons why we should take a naturalistic approach. One is because it helps us believe in a way that is correlated with reality. And if we want to survive in reality, it's pretty good to understand it well. But you also made the other point that it in a way, it's an enabler for our cooperation, because if we don't believe in ways that are in common, we struggle to cooperate. But at the same time, there are multiple ways of agreeing in common, right? One is we all share the same reality, so let's understand that reality naturalistically, and that's how we come to a common belief. The other one you already hinted at is we can believe things that have no foundation in reality, but we agree because of the group dynamic as an alternative approach.
So here's an interesting test case, I think, for naturalists and all of us, really. Think about the claim human beings have rights. Now, do you have any empirical evidence that this is true? Does reality itself, do we have any scientific instruments that can detect human rights? The answer is no. So the one question is, do rights really exist? And if your standard of accountable talk is purely, is there upstream evidence, what I call upstream evidence for it? The answer has to be no. But then we say something. If you say that there's no such thing as a right, then you can't say that we have a right to free speech. You can't say we have a right to be treated with dignity. I want to say those latter things. So I want to say there really are rights. But my case for why there are rights has nothing to do with the upstream empirical evidence, and a whole lot to do with the pragmatic usefulness of our mutual acceptance of rights. Now, is that reality-based believing? Is that reality-based claiming? It's an interesting test case, right?
Yeah, I agree. And I think we'll come back to that link, because that's one of the things that fascinates me. And I guess why I asked these two central questions is that link from naturalism into morality. And is there a boundary there, or is there actually a correlation we can draw? And I'd like to come back to that. But I guess going back to your earlier story, it was clear you grew up in a pretty naturalistic way of thinking, and you've certainly kept that and I guess formalized it since. Were there any points at which you were tempted by anything in the sort of supernatural or spiritual realm that wasn't strictly religious? Because many people will think immediately of religion, but there are many other areas where we can have beliefs that are maybe driven by wishful thinking or mysticism or woo. Or were you tempted by any of that at any point, or have you been hardline naturalistic thinking all the way through?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I've ever really been seriously tempted by supernaturalism. Yeah. But I'll give you, I think, a relevantly similar case. And this is a story I tell in the book. In high school, I was a shy, anxious, awkward kid. And I walked around a lot with a kind of a sad expression on my face. And a friend once pulled me aside and said, "Hey, Andy, why do you always carry such a sad expression?" And I'm like, "I don't know. I guess I just feel that way. I'm just being honest." And she was like, just smile. And I was like, "Yeah, but that would be dishonest. I'd be advertising a feeling, a happiness I don't really feel." She says, "Andy, stop being an idiot. Smile anyway." See, I was under the impression that my facial expression had to be an honest reflection of my interior state. And she knew that a smile is also an overture, an invitation for other people it's a welcoming overture to others. So I actually gave it a try. I just started smiling at people for no reason whatsoever. And a magical thing happened. People started smiling back. And all of a sudden I felt much like I was living in a friendlier world.
Yeah,
this was one of the best pieces of advice I ever got, and it utterly changed my outlook. I actually think that friend was delivering spiritual advice. I'm happy to call that spiritual guidance of a kind, but it was a kind of spiritual guidance that's perfectly compatible with naturalism.
Yeah. No, I love it. Great story. Now, one of the other things that you've worked on and done great work around, is about where did, I guess, naturalistic thinking or reasoning come from? And as someone who shares a naturalistic worldview, I guess ultimately that's a case of, evolution. So I'm interested in your view of how that naturalistic way of thinking came about in humans, but also presumably, before humans as well. Do you have a sort of story or a sense of why biological beings have come to be at least somewhat rational and naturalistic?
Yeah, I can sketch a story based on my understanding of the history of philosophy. Lucretius, who wrote a famous epic poem back in ancient Rome, which presents a very naturalistic point of view and casts doubt on whether filling our world with demons and gods is really a good idea. So some philosophers and thinkers have been urging a naturalistic way to understand our situation, the human condition, going all the way back, certainly to ancient Greece and probably earlier. And of course, after a long hiatus, naturalism was in underground by religious zealots, basically, and that pushed Europe into a 1,000-year dark age. And there's a reason we call the Middle Ages Dark Ages, or the medieval period the Dark Ages. Supernaturalism had gripped people's minds in ways that prevented them from thinking critically and actually inquiring openly about the root causes of things. The Black Death decimated Europe in part because the prevailing authorities at the time insisted on interpreting disease as something God was inflicting on us rather than, right? The germ theory of disease probably would have been discovered centuries earlier were it not for religious orthodoxy. And huge amounts of human suffering resulted. But of course, Europe clawed its way out of the Dark Ages during the Enlightenment, and that represented a renewed commitment to reason over faith on the one hand, but also a renewed commitment to naturalism. So some of my philosophical heroes were early modern thinkers who began to weave more naturalistic threads into their worldview. Many of them were Christian because it was you put your life in your hands if you rejected Christianity at the time. Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and John Stuart Mill a century or two later. These are men who helped us realize that rejecting supernatural assumptions and instead submitting to shared standards of accountable talk, and in particular evidence-based naturalism, that can actually enhance human well-being. And the evidence, by the way, about this, human welfare improved dramatically in the wake of this, in the wake of the Enlightenment. In roughly a century, levels of violence and human killing and inhumanity dropped by an order of magnitude because reason and naturalism arose.
And would you suggest that that's because, again, on average, humans had a better understanding of reality than they had before, which made it, easier for us to survive and prosper, but also we had a stronger common basis for understanding, therefore could cooperate? Or is it more complicated than that?
No, I think you're exactly right. I love the way you put it at the beginning. We need to understand the facts, and we also need to shape responsible thoughts about what matters, or responsible values. And the Enlightenment thinkers I'm most impressed with didn't shy away from questions about ethics and politics and religion. They actually said, hey, we need to think reasonably and responsibly about those things too. And when we do, turns out we get answers that are very different from the ones that religious authorities have been peddling for centuries and centuries. And the concept of human rights is actually a creature of the Enlightenment. It was an invention that was an invention of reason, of people who are committed to reason and naturalistic inquiry.
And you go ahead.
Well, just to say, and the concept of human rights, I think, has done enormous good in the world. It's done so much to make our lives safer and more prosperous.
Yeah, I'd agree. And as you've said, one of the things that's been interesting as I've been working on this sentientism idea has been tracing the roots of both a sentiocentric compassion, caring about non-humans as well as humans, but also naturalism back into history in an amateur way. But it's really interesting how deep and diverse those roots are, because if you look back into many different human cultures around the world, there were really strong, powerful threads of naturalist thought in every region, in almost every culture. And one of my favorite philosophers that actually brought the two together was a chap called Al-Mari, who was a blind Arab philosopher who I think lived around the year 900, and he was both had that sort of sentiocentric, essentially animal ethics mindset, and was totally naturalistic as well. And that was one of the other interesting things, is the degree to which, obviously, naturally, we might center on a European history and what happened in the Dark Ages, but some other cultures kept that light of naturalism burning much more strongly than some of the European ones.
And just to add to that, and I'll give the floor right back, historians tell us that basically Enlightenment ideas, commitment to reason, was preserved by Arab cultures during the Dark Ages. And one of the few reasons that Europe was able to climb out of the Dark Ages was that the ideas from the ancients that had been preserved by the Arabs found their way back into European intellectual culture.
Yeah, I agree. And how is it pushing the concept of naturalism too far to go even earlier and start thinking about this in terms of evolution? Both, I guess, human evolution, but even pre-human evolution, because I like to think that even very early animals crawling around in the Cambrian and the Precambrian, in a sense, have a naturalistic way of operating in the world, because they are sensing reality, they are building very simple models of reality, they're working out what the good stuff is and the bad stuff is, and they're going towards the good stuff and away from the bad stuff. And is it crazy to say, in a way, that is the sort of root of naturalism, is a deeply pre-human adaptation?
Let's see. So this is a fascinating question. I guess I would say that the overriding mandate that drives Darwinian evolution is survival. And where understanding the world around you accurately promotes that survival, you would expect clarity, honesty, and a naturalistic tendency of mind to be preserved and by natural selection. But where reality can actually harm your survival prospects, where realism or naturalism can harm your survival prospects, you might expect a different tendency of thought. Imagine a creature that was so reality-based that let's assume it's a male, that his commitment to reality-based believing was so intense that he didn't also make room in his mind. I'm imagining a very distant ancestor here, right? He didn't also make room in his mind for hope. This creature might very well have despaired and not failed to pass on his genes.
Yeah.
And sometimes people grasp non-reality based ideas in order to preserve hope, to fend off despair. And so I think that there's certainly some reason to think that natural selection would have instilled some fidelity to the facts, but also deviations from accurate understanding where it would help survival.
Yeah. And I think that's a really interesting way of framing it, because I have this sort of maybe naive hope that it's adaptive to be more naturalistic and to have so that there is a really strong correlation between the usefulness of belief and the accuracy of belief. I'd like to think that's true. And I think there's guardrails there, I think. But one of the other fascinating themes of your work is where that does go awry. The example you framed is a really interesting one. Sometimes actually it's more adaptive to be more optimistic than reality would lead you to be. Sometimes it's useful to have a sort of agency detection mechanism that is a bit paranoid, just in case there is a tiger in the bush. So it might not be totally accurate, but it's adaptive. And
that's a beautiful example. Yeah.
Yeah, and obviously it's not mine. Heard it from many others. But us weird humans have taken that to a whole other level, given our cognitive complexity, particularly when you start to think about some of the tribal and the group dynamics. And that's another classic area where, for an individual, often compliance with your tribe or your group's belief can be more adaptive in the short term than believing something that's really true. And that's, again, another theme that runs through your work, where you can have that break between, is this belief useful versus is it true? And I'm interested in your thoughts about how prevalent that is.
Yeah, so there's been several decades now of research in cognitive and social psychology, and they show that some of the most powerfully distorting influences on our thinking is our innate need to belong to a tribe. So tribal tendencies of thought distort our picture of reality. in very powerful ways. And you actually have to actively mitigate those tribal inclinations if you want to think clearly about reality.
Yeah.
And also, I would argue, to think clearly about morality.
Yeah, which will be our next topic. And there are some people I know who I've talked to on this series who do have a strongly naturalistic worldview, and they'd love everyone to take that worldview. But they're actually very pessimistic about our ability to do that, because they do think that tribal compliance is more powerfully adaptive than understanding reality accurately. So they will cite some research which says, look, if you look at certain communities, sometimes the more cohesive fundamentalist religious community might, score higher on certain well-being metrics or cohesiveness or whatever it is. And so they're pointing to that in a frustrated, pessimistic way and saying, look, how can we ever win with a fact-based reality, because it's super adaptive? How would you challenge that perspective, or would you?
Yeah, it's certainly true that our tribal instincts create huge obstacles to accurate shared understanding of reality. But I also diverge from the fatalism that I think you were suggesting your acquaintance may have attached to that. So look, the fact is, it's easy to focus on all of the kind of trenchant, obstinate kinds of tribal thinking that we see around us. But if you look at history, you also see instances where people overcame the worst elements of tribalism and forged more ecumenical and reality-based understanding. And so when we treat these cognitive biases as innate and just, oh, nothing you can do about it, you're actually giving away the game.
Yeah.
Because our understanding of reality and what matters is shaped both by innate tendencies and by voluntary and cultural factors that are in principle alterable. Mm-hmm. There are variables that we can adjust to make us less tribal in the way we think. And we need to focus not purely on the innate and unalterable things. We also need to pay attention to the variables that we can adjust so that we can create a less tribal future.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I think one of the interesting things that I think you find when you look into those tribal ways of thinking is that the expression of belief is often performative, but it's not necessarily that deep. And quite often there's some, I think it's called preference falsification, where people are saying, look, I know I need to say this because I've got to comply, but actually their deep held beliefs are actually much more naturalistic and grounded. And I think you can find that in most religious or supernatural communities today, is on a day-to-day basis and a minute-to-minute, really they have a naturalistic worldview. They are using evidence and reason to take their decisions. But for some, there is really a sort of performative layer that serves a function, but it doesn't really go that deep. And therefore it is open to change. And
well, you're drawing attention to a possible divergence between belief and deliberate avowals that often serve a kind of a virtue signaling or solidarity signaling function. So there's some really interesting work that suggests that a lot of the things people say are not so much believed, but they serve a social function. They're viewed as useful for cementing coalitional loyalty or whatever. And so the philosopher Daniel Dennett has said that most people who claim to believe in God probably believe that it's a good thing to believe in God rather than believe literally that God exists.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know how to test that hypothesis empirically, but it strikes me as a plausible possibility.
It does. And there are some interesting surveys that have been done in recent years which show that the prevalence of hidden atheists within religiously identifying communities is pretty high, even in some places where you really wouldn't expect to find that. So some Islamic theocracies, I think there were some surveys done recently in Iran which found some very surprisingly high percentages of people who under the covers really have an atheistic or a secular worldview. Yeah, it's interesting.
And when it becomes socially acceptable to be openly secular or openly atheistic, many people come out of the closet.
Yeah.
But
it's like a latent.
It's latent, but it's also suppressed by fear of social sanction. And fear of social sanction, of course, is one of the huge causes of dishonesty, both to oneself and to others. So we need to create an information ecosystem where people don't just signal out of fear, but who are driven by honest desire to deepen their understanding. And that's hard to do given human psychology, but it's not impossible. And we need to keep reminding ourselves that it's not impossible, because very small, in the book, I argue that very small changes in our immunity to bad ideas can produce huge changes in our collective well-being.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a lever. So the fatalism is probably not serving us well.
Yeah.
And may not even be as reality-based as we think.
I'd agree. And I think with the group dynamic, you can clearly imagine a situation where there is a tribe or a group that gets cohesion from a supernatural worldview, and that enables them to do very well, even over quite a long period of time. But I would argue that, again, on average, if you have one tribe that has a naturalistic and therefore more accurate way of understanding reality, and another tribe, however cohesive, that does not have a naturalistic way of understanding reality, the odds still over time benefit the naturalistic one. Whether that's enough or not, I don't know. Within the group, you might see, fine, I have to comply. But if your entire tribe believes things that aren't true, I'd argue that ultimately isn't adaptive either. So I don't know if that's another guardrail.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree fully with that. I do think that more secular and reality-based worldviews are destined to win out in the long run, but maybe not because they better serve secular communities, but because it better serves humanity writ large.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes sense. It's less about necessarily benefiting the individuals within the tribe. It's a broader
benefiting us all. So when you allow yourself to care about other tribes as well, and there are many forces at work in our culture that kind of compel us to care about other tribes too. We all kind of know at some level that completely vilifying them or treating them as absolutely worthless is not okay. And that sentiment has evolved over time, that human beings haven't always had that attitude. And the same thing, of course, is happening with animals. Most of us believe it's not okay to kick puppies because puppies can suffer, right?
Yeah. That brings us beautifully onto that second deep question: what matters morally? And again, for some guests, that's a story about how they grew up and what the sort of early intuitions, family values, and then how those have shifted over time. But for someone like you or I who has a naturalistic worldview, there's also a different cast there, because if someone has maybe a religious or a supernatural worldview, often their morality is grounded in that worldview. There's a list of rules, or there's a book, or there's a deity that is a perfect instantiation of God. And if we have a naturalistic worldview, there's an obvious question: okay, what is your morality grounded in, if anything? So there's two questions I like to ask in this section. One is, it'd be good to know that story, and how would you say your morality is grounded, if it is? But the second one, you've already hinted at there, which is, it's all very well to have compassion and to care for others. The question is, which others? And is it just your immediate family, or is it all of humanity? Does it go beyond humanity? So yeah, two crazily broad questions, but I'd love to know your sort of story on that and how you think about it now.
Yeah, I'm actually very eager to go where the questions you pose, I think, channel us all, because you're asking the right questions here. So I've long called myself a humanist, because I think when we identify as a member of the entire human family, that can help to mitigate more parochial kinds of tribalism.
Yeah.
So I think it would be a good thing for humanity if we all were taught to care about all human beings and all human beings equally. So a core principle of my humanism is that all human beings matter and all of us matter equally.
Yeah.
And I think that idea is enormously beneficial and has a long history of improving the human condition. Now, but I don't think it's defensible to draw a sharp boundary between humanity and other forms of conscious life. So I accept the label humanism, but I don't mean for that to exclude other forms of sentient life. I'm open to the suggestion that humanism is a suboptimal term for my outlook, and maybe sentientism is better. I suspect that term won't catch on just because it doesn't grab you in the same way. It's a little
syllables.
Too many syllables, yeah. But I love the idea. I think the idea is, I've taught animal ethics in the philosophy classroom, and I've taught articles that present the case for sentientism and against. And frankly, I've come to the conclusion that drawing a sharp line between human well-being and the well-being of other conscious creatures is just as indefensible as drawing a line between white people and black people, or between men and women. So in the same way that
right? It's I think it is arbitrary. Yeah. Mm.
In the same way that racism is wrong, only caring about human well-being is wrong.
Yeah, I'm clearly with you.
And the natural fact, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the natural fact that underlies that claim that it's just as bad is that animals can suffer too.
Yeah, I think that's the essence of it. You can go back to Bentham, can they suffer being the central question. But again, you go back much deeper than that. You can go back into Jainism, Buddhism, Rastafarianism, secular cultures going back thousands of years. And there are many deep, rich roots of thinkers recognizing, and it's not just our suffering that matters. And I'm very open to people coming up with better words than sentientism, because it is a bit of a mouthful. I frame it as just say sentient and put ism on the end, and that's a little easier. But even I stumble over it sometimes. So whether it will catch on, who knows? But I agree with you. In a sense, once you've put a supernatural morality to one side, which to my mind are often more about obedience than compassion or really caring for others, once you put that to one side, it seems to me that morality and ethics are really the choice to care about the experiences of others. And once you care about the experiences of others, it makes sense to care about all others that have experiences, i.e. are sentient, and excluding any of them seems arbitrary to me. So it seems to fit solidly.
And of course, you mentioned Jeremy Bentham, right? He's, of course, the founder of the school of thought known as utilitarianism. And both he and his follower, John Stuart Mill, basically, they try to present a thoroughly naturalistic understanding of how things can possibly matter.
Yeah.
And their basic argument is, what could possibly ground mattering in a world of facts other than sentience, the ability to experience things to experience joy or suffering, basically. Mill had a way of putting it in terms of actions that promote happiness are good to the extent that they promote happiness, and actions that promote unhappiness or pain are bad to the extent that they do that. And by offering that kind of way of measuring the goodness or badness of things, it was a thoroughly naturalistic, it was an attempt to say a thoroughly naturalistic approach to understanding good and bad, right and wrong, will actually help us evolve morally and give us a deeper understanding of right and wrong. But of course, once you recognize that human joy and suffering matter, you have to answer the question, what about puppy joy and suffering? And I don't see how any fair-minded person can conclude otherwise. Yeah. What do you think of rationalism as a term? I'm not sold on rationalism either, but if reason is the thing that pushes us to recognize other forms of sentient life and their moral worth as well, maybe rationalism is the term that might win out in the long run.
Well, this is interesting because I quite like, I don't mind the term rationalism, although to my mind, I tend to talk about using evidence and reason. So in my mind, the rationalism is the process, if you like, and the evidence is the content. So I talk about sentientism as being evidence, reason, and compassion. But I think rationalism works. I like naturalism, defined in a very broad sense. It's not just the scientific method, it's using evidence and reason, including our personal experiences, open-minded ways, with a default towards Bayesian reasoning, I guess, as well, that we should have beliefs that are probabilistic and provisional and prudent where there's risk. So I quite like those ways of thinking. And in a sense, you could say that is this decision about where you set the moral scope, hence sentiocentrism, is that redundant if a naturalistic approach leads you there anyway? Maybe all we need is naturalism. And I guess I'd be open to that. But the main challenge I have is that even people who are deeply committed to naturalism, rationality, and careful moral and ethical thinking still assume only humans matter. Even if in concept they recognize that other animals matter, they wouldn't kick a puppy. In practice, they grant basically zero moral consideration to most wild sentient animals and most farmed animals. So that's why I think we do need to specify both, right? I think we need naturalism to help us understand the world and to have a basis for knowledge that we can cooperate and share around. But we do also need an explicit statement that morality is about compassion for the experiences of others and all others that are sentient. We need to lay that out. And that's partly my frustration with the existing humanist movement, is that some humanist organizations have actually updated their definitions to say, oh, we also have a concern for other sentient beings. But the center of gravity is still almost completely anthropocentric. And even many humanists who say, well, I do have a concern for other sentient beings, it's not just about humans, will still happily have a bacon sandwich in the morning. And I just don't see how those two things are compatible at all. And even Bentham and Mill and some other quite serious thinkers about animal ethics still seem constrained by human social norms that imply that even if we have moral consideration for non-human animals, that farming them for our pleasure or exploiting them in different ways is acceptable. And I don't see how that logic flows through. So that's partly why, that's a long answer to your question, but I think we need to be explicit about sentience as the criteria for inclusion.
I think there's a lot to like about the way you lay it out. And let me confess first that I'm a very flawed advocate of sentientism. So theoretically, I think you're on extremely solid ground. And then when it comes to practice, I don't always forego the hamburger, right?
Yeah. That's where most of the human species is. There is a recognition that who would want to cause suffering to an animal, right? Most people wouldn't.
I want desperately to be the best person I can be. And I want to live up to my own rationalist ideals. I think I ought to behave in reasonably defensible ways at each and every moment I can. But when my wife fixes a meal that has meat in it, I don't rock the boat. I go along. I go along with it. And the way I excuse that is to say, I just admit it's weakness of will on my part. I think if I was a stronger person, I might say, I'm sorry, honey, I'm going to make my own dinner. Thank you for cooking for me. But actually, my wife has come an enormous way in the direction of fixing vegetarian meals. So meat is now the exception to the rule in the Norman household. And I think that's moral progress.
And it will just continue to get easier as well. The replacements, the alternatives, the social acceptability is just accelerating that shift. So.
Yeah. And I think, let me issue an invitation to other people who are struggling with their meat addictions. Say, you don't have to go cold turkey overnight. Just cut back a little bit year after year and gradually wean yourself off it. And you don't have to go to moral purity in one step. Although if you're strong enough to do it, go for it. I do have friends who've gone cold turkey on meat and maintained a completely meatless diet for years and years. And I got an enormous amount of admiration for that. But if you can't pull that off, go from having meat 5 times a week to 3 times a week and give yourself a few years to get there. That itself represents moral progress. It's something you can take pride in.
Yeah. And it's a fascinating debate within communities that are focused on animal advocacy and veganism, of course, and often those battles within the community are more vicious than the ones outside of it, as any vegan on Twitter will know. But it's a difficult psychological journey to go on, I think, because on the one hand, I think when people start to recognize the reality of, for example, what animal farming is, it does jump you to a position where your natural response is to be quite preachy and aggressive and assertive and pushing for that sort of purity just because you can see the wrong so clearly. But at the same time, I think there is a broad recognition that tone, that sort of preachy, moralizing tone, is whether or not it's justified, isn't really that highly effective. It works with some people, right? Shame works with some people, shock works with some people, but it's a very slow process if that's all you're going to work with. So I think there is a sense to be effective, we need to find ways of meeting people where they are, understanding the context they're in, understanding the power of the social norms they've grown up in, and also, to your point, making it easier for people to do the right thing with alternatives and social acceptability and so on.
Right.
But to my mind, it is a fascinating test case, because in the way most of the people who focus on your type of work around mental immunity and rationalism and skepticism, and I include myself in that group, will focus on religion, the supernatural, will focus on cults and conspiracy theories, will focus on MLMs and anti-vaxxers and homeopathy, and the list goes on. And I think all of those, and tribal political dynamics and populism, there's so much pain and power and danger in all of those different fields. But to my mind, I do include this way of thinking about animal ethics as another one of those cases. And most people in the humanist, skeptic, rationalist community, for them, it's really like kryptonite, right? So they will be very confident of their ability to apply evidence and reason, to challenge social norms. Many of them have broken out of really strict social indoctrination around religious ways of thinking, and they're proud they found a more compassionate, rational way of thinking.
Yes.
But when you engage them on the ethics of animal farming, suddenly the conversation, it almost feels like I'm talking to a cult member or a conspiracy theorist all over again. But this person is a humanist, or this person is a rationalist, or this. So I think it's another interesting class of cognitive dissonance, or crazier social norms that we've really got to break through.
Yeah, there's certainly lots of people who feel as though they've awoken from a religious delusion or religious indoctrination and have freed themselves from religious modes of thought. And yet they struggle to free themselves from meat-centric or human-centric ethics. And of course, anytime you present somebody else as morally wanting, people get defensive really fast.
Yeah.
When abolitionists told slave owners, you are morally backward in continuing this institution of slavery, the slave owners fought back.
Yeah, double down.
And every time moral progressives try to move the needle and make us raise our moral standards, the morally backward push back. And and it's hard because when you challenge somebody's ethics, they feel as though their character is at stake.
It's an identity thing.
It's an identity
the core
thing.
of who they are, right? Yeah.
That's right. So the problem here is exactly the same, whether you're trying to get people to let go of their meat-eating habits, or let go of their conspiracy theory, or let go of their political ideology or religious ideology. It's all the same problem. I argue in the book that when we respond defensively to good information or good arguments, that's the mind's immune system going into hyperdrive to fight off a perceived threat.
Yeah.
So if you hitch your identity to a set of ideas, then anybody who questions those ideas, it's going to feel like an attack, and your mind's immune system will react by trying to neutralize the new information, even if it's a good argument, even if it's solid, reliable information. And so we need to understand the ways in which our mental immune systems betray us or mislead us. It's very easy, actually, to hotwire somebody else's mind. And you do it through spreading fear or disdain. Here in America, we just had 4 years of a president who would heap disdain and stoke fears in order to hotwire the minds of his own followers.
Yeah.
And it works because mental immune systems are these very delicate, finicky things that can be manipulated.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the interesting things about your concept of mental virology and immunology, is that your immune system doesn't just do good things. It might reject a kidney you've been donated, or it can fire off at the wrong stuff. And in a way, it's central to the final question is, how do you think about the future, and how can we make the world a better place? Because it strikes me that in quite a few of the domains we've talked about, whether it's conspiracy theory or anti-vaxxing or religion, or Melanie Joy calls carnism, this sort of sense that I don't want to harm animals, but it's normal, nice, necessary, and natural. So in all of those situations, it doesn't feel like it's a question of logic or ethic or evidence or rationality or even a technical challenge. It seems to me, I think you and I would agree on most of those fronts, the answer is pretty self-evident in a way. The challenge is more one of human psychology and these mental immune systems and how they work for good or for ill. So what's your sense of how we can work on that human psychology and that sort of mental immune system? What's the sort of prescription in your work about how we can make that a positive force for good?
So the short answer is that we can better understand how our minds filter out bad ideas, and how those filtering mechanisms sometimes misfire. And we can actually, in the same way that we can train our body's immune system to recognize COVID or the coronavirus and eliminate it from the body, you can train your mind's immune system to identify a dysfunctional ideology and reject it. So in principle, the wisest people in the world, I think, are ones who are really good at spotting bad ideas and shedding them. And when you build your mind's immune system, develop it so that it's more sensitive to nonsense, more sensitive to to bad ideas that often pass for good, you actually become wiser. You become a better contributor to human and animal welfare, I think.
Yeah.
So I think that this new science of what I call cognitive immunology, the science of mental immunity, is a linchpin. It's a lever point. If we can spread knowledge of of what it means to be for your mind's immune system to be healthy, if we can spread awareness of that and begin to develop our institutions so that they support mental immune health, then divisive ideologies and conspiracy thinking and science denial and irrational views about the permissibility of eating meat are going to become far less tenacious and easier to dislodge and replace. And that's the path to, I think, to progress and saving our world from a potential climate change disaster as well.
Ourselves from ourselves. Yeah.
Hey, would you mind if I circled back to a couple things you touched on earlier?
Of course. If you're okay for time as well, I don't want to.
Yeah, thanks. You mentioned at one point that you see a need to append sentientism to naturalism to deal with the moral side of things.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, I'm suggesting that we need sentiocentrism, which is just setting your moral scope based on sentience, in opposition to anthropocentrism or biocentrism or ecocentrism. I'm saying sentiocentrism is how to set the moral scope, but then we also need naturalism to ground our belief formation. And I'm suggesting we use the term sentientism as the combination of the two. It's naturalism and sentiocentrism.
I see. But I think you also mentioned the possibility that our concept of naturalism might expand in such a way that the word sentientism might not be necessary. I want to comment on that for a second, just because, and the key problem there from a philosophical point of view is how do you treat ought statements?
Yeah.
And do you believe in moral facts? Because if moral facts exist, then deep fidelity to the facts, naturalism, could eventually expand to the point where you don't need to overlay it with separate value assumptions, such as sentientism. You would simply recognize that a puppy's ability to suffer is a fact.
Yeah, it would flow directly from
the naturalism. So I think that's a possible future. And by the way, here's a really interesting argument that I've helped to develop for the idea that moral facts exist. So highly controversial claim. Most philosophers go, nah, moral facts, that doesn't sound right. But I think it's an actual fact that kindness is more conducive to our collective flourishing than cruelty is. That's an objective fact.
Yeah.
Furthermore, honesty is objectively more conducive to our collective flourishing than dishonesty is. Justice is objectively preferable to injustice because it promotes human well-being and perhaps other forms of well-being. In other words, we need to stop pretending that values are merely subjective, because there are, in fact, objective moral facts. Some attitudes and some forms of behavior are objectively more conducive to well-being, and that's what it means to say that they are better or right.
Yeah. And is there another step that's needed, though, to say, and this, you get into really crazy sounding statements, right? Why is well-being good?
Well, that's beautiful. So this is my next book. And so the traditional argument for why you can't derive an ought from an is that a set of is statements will never entail a conclusion with an ought in it.
Yeah.
And as a logical point, I think that's correct. But I actually think that you need one and only one value premise. If you imagine a huge cauldron full of facts. You can drop in one tiny little value assumption. Imagine like a grain of salt. And all of a sudden, the entire world takes on value significance. And that grain of moral truth can be stated in a ridiculously simple and obvious and in an undeniable way. Well-being matters.
Yeah.
That's almost definitionally true.
Yeah.
It's a value assumption. It's almost definitionally true. And if you combine that with the facts, you can get as rich and as robust a set of moral principles as you could possibly want.
Yeah, I'm with you. So I think I tend to find maybe a middle ground. So I don't call myself a moral realist in the sense that I think there are platonic moral facts floating out in the universe that existed before humans or before sentient beings. I think before sentient beings existed, there was no such thing as morality at all. It was just an empty concept that didn't exist. But as soon as sentient beings come into existence, I think morality almost definitionally is a concern for the experiences of others, hence well-being, suffering, flourishing. So in a sense, you can choose not to care about well-being and you can choose not to care about the suffering of others, but that just is the choice not to be moral. And you can do that if you like. There's no, hopefully the rest of us will constrain you. In a sense that you could say that's still an arbitrary choice. It's an independent choice. You could choose to do otherwise. So in that sense, I'm not a moral realist, but in the sense that morality almost definitionally is about the concern for the experiences of others, and therefore well-being matters, suffering matters, flourishing matters. Once you're there, I totally agree that I don't like suffering. I'm pretty sure you don't like suffering either. Morality is just a decision for me to care about that.
I love the stance you've just laid out, but I think you can make it even stronger in one way. If you're going to say that well-being matters, has an arbitrary feature to it, then you might just as well say that health is a preference for health is arbitrary versus a preference for illness, which is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Nobody denies that the medical sciences are real and based and can be objective in the relevant sense. And all of medicine is based on the idea that health is a good thing. In the exact same way, we can start with the premise that well-being is a good thing and erect a science that is every bit as objective as medicine.
Yeah. So maybe we'll get there. I think maybe we'll get to a point where we don't need the term sentiocentrism or sentientism anymore, because if you're naturalistic, you're there anyway. But until I've managed to persuade all humanists to go vegan, I'm gonna stick at being specific and very clear about sentient beings.
I won't try to dissuade you from that. I think that's maybe the right tactic.
Was there another theme you wanted to layer in before we start to look at wrapping up? Or
yeah, actually, I think I've touched on both of the things I wanted to touch on. So thank you for that.
That was great. Thank you. And it's fascinating to hear how you balance that, because I think some people look at the is-or thing and say it's incontrovertible and cannot be broken. And I tend to think, well, one, it can be broken in the way we've described. And if it can't be broken in a way that's trivial, because suffering matters. So
I think you can overplay the idea that there's a gulf between the facts and the values and is and oughts, because there are many facts that have value significance, that are morally significant, given very simple and elemental and unproblematic value presumptions, such as more well-being among conscious creatures is better than less.
Yeah, I agree. And if someone wants to claim that if I put a fork into their hand, their choice about whether to enjoy that or not is arbitrary, take that view if you like, but I would argue that's probably not going to be adaptive for them in the medium term. And keep away from hot stoves and cliff edges. And
exactly.
Yeah, hopefully, I think you've laid out a sort of what I think is a hopeful vision there, and that ultimately a better appreciation for reality, will prove to be adaptive, and it'll also prove to be a world where we care more generously about the well-being of all others too. So, does it leave you feeling optimistic, pessimistic in the current state of the world?
Yeah, I am, and it's great talking to you, people like you who've thought these things through so carefully and in a way that's really consistent with compassion as well. So that's great. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. I think you're doing great stuff. I really like what you're doing here.
Thank you. And it doesn't pretend to be a complete philosophy in any way, because I think it's most important to set a baseline, if you like, a really pluralistic baseline that just says naturalism and sentiocentrism. Those are the two foundations. Beyond that, there's still so much philosophy to fight over. There are competing interests. You could argue about whether we should be more virtue-focused or deontological or utilitarian or Kantian. You could apply all of those ethics in a sentientist context, if you like. There's so much, crazy complexity to work on and so much to fight over. But let's at least lock in those basics that we should try and understand reality using evidence and reason, and we should have compassion for all sentient beings. That seems like a solid starting point, and maybe one that could even be, unashamedly universal. People are very nervous about suggesting universal ways of thinking, but I think if those are the only two things we're pushing,
Well, maybe this is an opportunity for you to add an element to this. I don't know if you want, if it suits your purposes to, but naturalism is first and foremost an ontological position, an idea of this is real and other stuff isn't. And sentientism, or sentiocentrism, as you've described it, is a view about what matters, which would normally be thought of as a branch of ethics. And another major branch of philosophy is epistemology, which is how do you think about responsible thinking? How do you think about the difference between knowledge and mere opinion? I actually think you should incorporate a cognitive immunology perspective on the epistemological side, and the three together could really go places, I think.
That sounds good. It could be a powerful upgrade. It could be a powerful upgrade. Yeah.
There we go.
Andy, thank you. It's been a real privilege to talk to you. What's the best way of people following you, finding more about your work, and of course, reading your book?
Yeah, thanks. The book's available wherever books are sold. I believe it's been released in England. If it hasn't yet, it will be soon. And in much of the rest of the English-speaking world. But Amazon has it, Barnes & Noble has it. You can learn more about my work at andynorman.org. And I'm trying to share my journey and sharing these ideas on Facebook at Andy Norman Author.
That's brilliant. Thank you. I'll include the links in the show notes so my audience can click through. Like I said, I can't offer you a sort of Joe Rogan scale audience, but now you're on this podcast, you've really made it, Andy.
Okay,
well,
I love it.
Thank you again. And I'm looking forward to you renaming the Carnegie Mellon Humanism Institute to the Carnegie Mellon Sentientism Institute. I'll even chip in for the new signage when you get it done. So.
I'll bring it to the attention of the student leaders. But
brilliant.
I do like the suggestion.
Yeah.
All right.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Andy. I'll let you get on with your day. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
My pleasure as well. Take care.